And if you all see, if you don't know Zoom a little bit on the speaker view, you can change what you see. We'll be sharing the screen some of the time, and then other times we'll just be in conversations together. So everyone, you're very, very welcome. My name is Jennifer Lentfer. I am the creator of How Matters. And just a quick tidying of administrative, if everyone can mute themselves as you're listening, that'd be appreciated. This is the second online dialogue series associated with the Shift the Power Symposium, and this is a follow-on conversation from some that happened in London a few weeks ago. But I think this is an ongoing conversation that we've been having for a long time, which is really poking, we poked all the holes in poverty porn. So why do we continue to communicate in ways that actually are harmful and really antithetical to our mission and our vision as people who want to change things in the world? So I just want to start off by thanking everyone for coming, thanking to the Global Fund for Community Foundations and our speakers, Maria and Grace, who I'll introduce here in just a moment. You're very welcome. I'm Jennifer Lentfer, and to new people that are coming in just now. We're here today, we're trying to open up a conversation about old school NGO communications. And we're trying to really get beyond all of the cliches and also speak about some of the harm that's actually being done when we rely on old tropes. And I think we have an obligation to do better when we know better. And I suspect that's actually why a lot of you are here. This is a space where we're coming together to support each other, to think through these issues. And I will say that by talking about this stuff, we're inviting sometimes difficult things to come forward. We have to talk about this. It's actually essential. It's hard, it's imperfect. But what's happening is we're calling for accountability that doesn't exist yet, which is often uncomfortable and really exciting though at the same time. We're not going to fix communications with the right politics or the right arguments, and we have to all expect that all of us as communicators will screw up and fail sometimes, but it's really this trial and error and building practice in ways that don't recreate harm that is our shared goal here today. And I just want to also say that as a host, as a white person, I am going to make mistakes, and I'm hosting this series because I wanted to invite people into my own learning process and hear from people that I consider to be my teachers. And we do this together because we know that we are privileged within a system, and thus we kind of have a responsibility to get our shit together. We'll talk about what power communications professionals actually hold in all of this. And so I'm really, really pleased today to be joined by two people who are also going to share their perspectives from where they are in this system. Grace Labiodan is a global development professional, and she is specializing in development communications. And we are celebrating big time today because Grace graduated with a degree from the University of Reading this actual morning. Yeah. She now is a master's in applied development. She is passionate about justice, gender equity, and believes that stories not only matter, but they are actually key to affecting the necessary changes we're talking about. And Grace has worked for a number of organizations in the communications capacity, most recently AMREF Health Africa UK and Malaria No More UK. And Grace, welcome, and we're celebrating your big achievement today.
Thank you, Jen. Thanks for having me. Hello, everyone.
Yeah, thanks. And Maria Faciolince is an anthropologist, a researcher, a photographer, a multimedia communicator. She has lots of roots. She's a Latin American woman in the global North diaspora, and she's got loads of frustrations with portrayals of development, poverty, social justice. But she's turned that into a passion, and now her mission is to elevate voices from global South communities and really craft more participatory communications so that we can humanize these issues and really popularize the conversations we all need to have. She's worked as a researcher with the Environmental Justice Atlas in Barcelona and the Center for Latin American Documentation in Amsterdam. She's worked alongside indigenous communities in Colombia, Honduras. She's taken undertaken social documentary reporting on the social and solidarity economy. She's worked with TNI, Frida, Friends of the Earth, but now she's leading the Power Shifts project at Oxfam. And this is a space for conversations that increase the visibility of critical voices and people-led initiatives in the Global South. Of course, she's also a community organizer in local migrant rights with Collectiva Qatari, a Latin American decolonial feminist collective, and movements for gender and social justice, which we all are, right? Thank you for being with us, Maria.
Thanks so much for inviting me, Jennifer.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone.
So what's going to happen next is, this really is only an hour conversation, even though the invite is for an hour and a half, because we want to keep this to 1 hour, keep it tight, keep it lunchtime or mealtime or break time maybe for people, breakfast for people on the West Coast of the US. And the idea is that each one of these dialogues sort of stands on its own, but there is a series. So folks that signed up for today will get the slides and the recording, of course, but also for subsequent and previous dialogues. So we want to take these conversations like in a whole, knowing that none of this is easy and solved easily, right? But I want you just to know, like, I'm so inspired by all the interest that has come for these dialogue series. What it says to me is that we're hungry and ready, and so we're on the cusp of something really important. So thank you all for being with us. What's going to happen is I'll do a quick recap of the first online dialogue and some of the key concepts that are holding these conversations. And then I'll do a quick exercise, because I really believe in writing exercises and the fact that we're all creatives and that we actually need to bring more and more creativity to communicate differently about these issues. And then I'll hand over to my two guests, and then we'll open up for questions and just have some time together to think together about some of these issues. So welcome. I'm gonna share the screen again and just go quickly through a couple slides so that we can have a shared sense of what we're talking about today. So here we go. Ta-da. It's telling me that I'll stop again. Sorry, everybody. Trying again. Of course, I thought I was ready. One more sharing. Here we go. It's loading. Yes. Thanks for your patience, everybody. So what are we talking about? Why are we all here? What do we mean by changing the narrative? At the bottom of the screen, you'll see what I think, unfortunately, is the social good narrative right now, which is someone is poor, needy, marginalized, this benevolence arrives, this help arrives, and then everything is solved. And I think that, unfortunately, that's what NGOs have been putting out for a really long time. But shift the power as we understand it really requires some new narrative frames, and that's what we're here to talk about. And I want to say that when we talk about narratives, we're really getting at what's below people's action and their behavior, what's their motivation, how do they perceive the world. And these choices that we make as communicators often reflect rhetoric found in the political discourse, and it happens consciously and unconsciously. But there's some social good frames that are very problematic that we'll highlight and then talk about new ways forward. We are evolving, and shift the power is going to mean different things to different people. But I think in general, what I think of it as is the centralized decision making, addressing the privilege and the power imbalances that are rooted in racism and imperialism that is the backdrop of our sector. I think shift the power means self-determination and recognizing people's lived experiences as expertise. It's about shifting notions of scale, of small. I think it's about releasing the romanticism of doing good. And I think ultimately Shift the Power is about getting political and holding people in all hierarchies of power to account. And what we know is, as people in this sector who maybe have more formal jobs in the sector, we know that holding power to account includes in our own organizations. So I don't want to gloss over the fact, that fact. But this is what we mean when we're talking about Shift the Power. Now, when you frames, here we go. Narrative frames are the collective understandings. What happened? What is the backdrop for how people receive your content, right? What are the narratives or the operating assumptions that are held by the larger society? And in the case of global development, global health, social enterprise, all of our do-gooder endeavors, I think that there's 5 narrative frames that are pretty problematic. One is just the notions of the poor. And unfortunately, we have lots of ideas. The dominant culture holds lots of ideas about the poor as helpless, incapable, desperate. We also have the narrative frame of over there, which is very nationalistic. But in other words, these problems are far away. It's another reality. It's not connected to my life. Ideas of the other. And I think ultimately ideas of benevolence and helping, which is sort of tells those people in rich countries that helping means you are inherently good, that making a difference is simple and easy, and intention is what counts. And I just think we've got to move forward on that. The power of communications, what we do as communicators all day, is that we choose to either uphold or challenge society's existing narrative frames. And part of this series, I think, is a clarion call to all of us to get political and think really intentionally about dignity, voice, and representation. When it comes to decolonizing communications, I think putting those ideas at the center of how we do this work fundamentally is what we're talking about in terms of the change we want to see. So I am going to ask us just to do a brief exercise. So if you have a computer, a pen, a paper, whatever you have in front of you, I'm going to ask each one of you to think of someone from your childhood who was kind to you. It could be a grandma, could be a neighbor, and I'm going to have you free write for 4 minutes. And if anybody's not done free writing before, free writing is really about your stream of consciousness. Don't think, and don't lift your pen from the paper or your hands from the keyboard. What you write is what comes out. You're not self-editing in any way. So I'm going to start this timer. We're going to take 4 minutes, and then I'll ask you some follow-up questions. So go ahead. We're going to take a little pause for 4 minutes. So who was this person? What do they look like? What do you know about them? Be as descriptive as you can. Use all your senses. 1 minute left. Okay, you can go ahead and finish up your last phrase or sentence. And now I'm going to ask you to read what you wrote and underline the words that pop out to you as the words or phrases that really best describe this person. And then in the chat, I want you all to share some of those words or phrases that you offered and observed about this person. What are the things that really demonstrate to you who they were? Thoughtful, good listener, wise, soft, warm, loving, passionate, dedicated, warm, beautiful, unconditional love, sensitive, trust, joyful, and wrinkly, all careful, polite, gentle, warm. These are amazing. I can feel a lot of love that you are bringing forth as you describe these people. But here's our moment of reflection. Are these words that are often used to describe the people we're writing about as global development professionals? And why does this differ? And of course, we have various levels between us and people. Often if you're a communications professional working in headquarters, you are many levels or modes of bureaucracy removed. But there is a real difference between a caricature and a character when it comes to just narratives and writing and literature. And we know that if we are creating caricatures or just ideas of people, what's happening is we're probably reinforcing some narrative frames that really need to be challenged. So how do we create an intimacy? How do we sort of broker the power we have and make sure that we're representing people in the whole ways that really show who they are as people, not just their circumstances. And I think that's one of the goals that we need to think about and ascribe to, and really will help us get real clear about how we can help people to tell their own stories as opposed to us telling them for them. Now, I know this is a big ask. There's a lot of things to think about with regards to that, and it's a long transition that we're going to be part of. Communicators have to balance a lot of things all day long, but today I think we're dealing with these questions of voice, of dignity, of narrative. Who tells the stories that make them up, and to what end are they told, and who makes those decisions? These are all the things that we're grappling with as communicators today. So now I'm going to turn over to my speakers for their thoughts and insights. I've asked them a couple questions to start today, and I'll start with Grace. I'm going to and I'll just show you the questions that we're all going to chew on together, which is, if there is no such thing as a voice for the voiceless, only those not listening, how do our jobs change? And how do we convey and communicate dignity when we're sharing details about other people's lives? So I'll hand over to Grace.
Oh, could you, sorry, the questions have gone, Jen, so could you just say them again, just so I can have a think?
I will do, yeah. But feel free to just, in a little, also just to Grace, talk about some of the things that you've been thinking about in preparation for today as well.
So for me, I suppose the main things, particularly thinking about, great, thank you, the questions are up there. Okay, particularly thinking about the global development communications space in the UK. Recently, there's been a lot of conversation around, you know, this exact thing. So how do we convey dignity? How do we tell stories about people who don't live where we live, don't live lives like we live, are going through completely different issues that we would face here in the UK on a day-to-day? How do we tell stories about those people in a way that does not portray them as helpless or disempowered or voiceless, but actually in a way that shows that they are capable and they are competent, and quite honestly don't necessarily need our help, if you know what I'm trying to say. I think the difficult thing that I have found, kind of being in this space and watching and learning and seeing, is how it can be really hard for organizations to balance the need for fundraising communications. That means that you need a specific type of story or narrative about people that to drive up funds or raise funds from this specific market, versus, so balancing that versus also not exaggerating stories or situations or issues, and not making things appear worse maybe than they are because you want more funds. So kind of balancing out the negative narrative versus the positive narrative, where statistics often show that maybe, you know, a specific village in Ghana, for example, people might not care much to give money towards that if they know that actually that village now has running water and they've been fine for a few years. You know what I'm trying to say? So I think, you know, so I think that has been, I think, one of the key conversations in this area is balancing that kind of negative communications that works in terms of fundraising versus how do we actually just tell stories about people's lives that, you know, is dignified for them. So in terms of is there no such thing as a voice for the voiceless, only those not listening, and how do our jobs change, and also conveying dignity where sharing when sharing details about other people's lives. I think a key place to start from is honesty. I just think it's important for those who are working in this space to be honest and truthful about, you know, if you've got projects in different parts of Africa or South America, for example, I think it's important to be honest about what's happening in those places by listening to partners that you have who are working on the ground. But at the same time, I think it's okay to say, you know, this might be the reality of this specific community, but this is not all they are going through. You know, there are also very empowering things that are happening in this community, and there are also very, you know, very great things that are happening in this community, and this is the reason why we do the work we do. So those are sort of like, I guess, yeah, the main things that have been coming out of like just conversation specifically in the UK market at the moment. I hope that helps.
It does. And Grace, when you see something in your work, you know, someone hands you a blog and it has some what you consider to be problematic things in it. How do you have that? How do you open up that conversation?
Oh, it's really difficult, and kind of, you know, for not to like jump right in there with the whole race thing, but like as a woman of color, as a Black woman working in international development, some communications is a little bit cringy, and like you said, like backdated and old fashioned, and it's like nobody uses imagery like that anymore, or you know, those sorts of things. And that kind of thing can be really difficult to explain to older white men, sometimes even older white women who have been in the space for a very long time, and for them this is something that has worked for decades, and all of a sudden you're having to think about changing, you know. So even like little things like going to like a school or an orphanage and just taking pictures with random brown babies, like that's kind of not okay anymore. But explaining why it isn't can sometimes be very difficult. I'm very fortunate to work in a space where I have colleagues who encourage me to call things out like this, because they also acknowledge that their positionality as white men or white women, that for them it can be difficult to see why certain imagery is problematic, or you know, or certain words or phrases, you know, connote specific stereotypes that, you know, is not really all the way true. So I'm really fortunate to work in a space like that, but I can appreciate that that's not everybody's story. And at the same time, something that can sometimes also be difficult is being seen as the one who kind of can speak for like the whole community, and you're like, I'm just like me, like, you know. And it's like, oh well, you know, you would know about X community because like that's your family's heritage, and it's like, okay, but that doesn't mean like I can speak for those specific people, right? So I think that, like, you know, I've been asked if I know the diaspora, and I'm like, I mean, like the African diaspora, like all of us, like there's a lot, you know. So it's like, so sometimes things like, you know, there's the assumption that, oh, okay, you're of this heritage, so you will know about XYZ, and being seen as like the calling point, when actually it's just as much a learning process for me as it is for anyone else. So that can be a little bit challenging.
Yeah, I hear that. I do. And I think we're all in this really interesting moment where we're being asked to no longer be content creators. Like less and less do I, as a communications professional, need to be the one writing. And instead I need to be a content producer. I need to support other people to just take what they're doing and elevate it and amplify it to other audiences. And sometimes there's a translator role, like you're talking about, that we kind of have to play. And what's difficult too is, yes, I think there's been a transactional turnkey of fundraising. We know that this works. Well, actually, first of all, it doesn't work anymore. I think the big INGOs are also understanding that direct mail to boomers is starting to fail, and that we have to attract more young donors who aren't necessarily loyal in the same way, and here in the US at least. And I think in particular, it's asking people to not just see themselves as part of an organization, but part of a much bigger global system that is connected to all these other systems. And that is a big, like, it's a big thing to explain, as you're saying, in that moment. So so these little moments that we can have the courage, which is important, they have the courage to sort of take that little risk. So thank you.
And I think if you're constantly asking questions, you're constantly in a space of learning. I think for an individual or an organization, I think that's a good thing. Because sometimes it is, for example, I work at Malaria No More, and images of children with like bugs on their faces, like, and stuff like that's sort of inappropriate. But then it's like malaria is caused by mosquitoes, you know. So it's like, we wouldn't use images like that, but maybe there are some images where actually it might be appropriate to have a child in there. But I think it's just being aware of, you know, the connotations and how these sorts of things can look. And I think you're right in terms of younger donors, millennials and like maybe, you know, Gen Z. I think a lot of them are asking questions and they're like, what, like charity's been going on for how many years and nothing's changed, like really, so why should I bother giving my money then? But I think a lot of people are asking those questions, and you know, people want more transparency and more honesty, and it's not going to be enough to just be like, oh, this poor community in X place really needs your £2 a month or whatever. You know, there's gonna have to be a little bit more than that now, I think, specifically in this climate, because people just aren't buying that anymore.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks. We're gonna move quickly to Maria. Thank you, Grace, and we'll have more time with you in the Q&A. Maria, please go ahead and share your perspective and what's you've been up to this week. Maria is in Madrid at COP.
Hi, everyone. Hi, thanks so much for allowing me to join this conversation. Yeah, so I'm in Madrid right now. I'm at the UN climate negotiations, and it's been really interesting. So I think some of my reflections will feed off of the experiences of this week. First, I want to say that, and I want to start with saying that I am still learning about all of this. I come into this work of communications from my, you know, research, anthropological sort of background. So actually, I come into communications out of this sort of realization that I have a responsibility of representation. You know, if I'm ever to speak with someone and about someone, then there's a responsibility that comes with that. And if we're serious about shifting the world, we really need to rely on our imagination and our sort of human connection and empathy to also shift people's mindsets. So I just want to start by saying that's my point of entry into this work. And with the Power Shifts project that I've been sort of, leading, I suppose, in the last couple of months with Oxfam, I've come to realize that my work is, you know, officially called content producer, but essentially, I've really realized that actually what I'm doing is facilitating, right? So I have stopped seeing this role or ceased to explain, you know, this work as, oh, I'm an editor or I'm a content producer or a developer. And I'm just like, I'm facilitating conversations because it's not just about who is talking, but how we're talking. So just to like recap and build off of what Grace was saying, I think what Grace is saying is really interesting and important to name again, is this balancing of expectations, right? And it comes with a lot of contradictions, you know, when you're working in a very institutionalized setting, I suppose, that comes with structures, that comes with demands, that comes with, you know, KPIs and outputs and all the metrics that you have to comply with. So I want to talk about a little bit about these institutionalized expectations for storytelling and communicating social change, and how those in turn feed into something which I've come to call an extractive process. So an extractive form of content creation, if we want to call it, and which feeds into what Jennifer was calling, you know, the reproduction of caricature. So first of all, there's expectations around pace, right? And like speed and time. So things have to come out in breaking news. There has to be a constant output. We have to keep up with the news cycle of relevance. If not, if we take it out, you know, if we get this interview out next week, it's not going to be relevant. We have to like be churning out stuff constantly, right? And this is what everyone's thinking. So we've got, you know, 17 different platforms reproducing content, and there's so much content out there accumulating. So why not amplify what's already happening instead of sort of consistently being urged to add up, you know, to that pile. Another thing is that in terms of also the timing and things like and pace, is that we also assume that story sharing kind of is benign in every sense, and that all communities want it, and that everyone wants to tell their story, and that visibility is inherently good. So I think we have to also question that constantly, because there are institutional expectations of, you know, making things visible, you know, making the issues visible, making the actors visible. But how many times has this visibility actually brought about a whole new set of consequences that aren't really reflected upon before, you know, doing your PR, your comms, and your marketing strategies. Next up, I think there's a few other things to do with how we actually produce the content, specifically the sort of text centrism, right? So there's so much weight put on text and on the written word. And if we want to access so many different types of knowledge, wisdom, and experience and expertise, we really need to rethink that protagonism that we give to sort of the written word, and tap into other forms of communication. And this takes me into language as well, because as someone who, I mean, I did my education in English, but most of my contacts and work has been in the sort of Spanish-speaking world. And the sort of disconnect between even just linguistic you know, forms of content and ways of expression and everything else that follows is abysmal, and it's huge. And the sort of Anglo-centric communication that we have about the world is never going to shift power if we keep sort of that centrality of the English language. And that takes me back to another thing, which is another organizational barrier that I see to sort of deconstructing social change communication, and that's the silos that we're put into in like framings about issues, right? So there's climate, there's gender, there's humanitarian, there's food, and these are sort of broken up into clear-cut thematic areas that are taken as technical specialties, right? But actually they're quite arbitrary, and they really come from a Eurocentric Western frame, to see climate and gender as two separate things when they're identities and situations that affect transversely and cross-cuttingly a lot of people. It's hard to sort of come to a framing that actually speaks to a reality in a way that dignifies people's experience of it. So to speak of, you know, food security as opposed to justice, or food sovereignty, is also really depoliticizing. And that takes me to tokenizing, which Grace, you actually mentioned just now, how, like, you know, this one person who carries one sort of identity becomes the loudspeaker for this entire very plural and diverse community. And I've seen it at the COP just now. So there's a lot of indigenous constituencies and delegations, and, you know, and some of them have beautiful, you know, body adornments and facial paint, etc. And they're invited to the table, right? And they're allowed to speak, but it's kind of like, and I've spoken to a few of them, and today I was speaking to a woman from Peru, from the Ashaninka community, and she's like, well, it's kind of like they've invited us to sit there, to welcome to sit at the table, but only speak when and how we want you to. So yesterday, a few people actually raised their voices around this. 300 delegates, I don't know if you saw the news, but kind of raised their voice and started hitting pots and pans, which is now a very Latin American, but also universal sort of protest tool. And they got kicked out of the conference center by UN security. Yeah. And some people got debadged, and a lot of the delegates that came from across the world are not allowed back in. So this just speaks to the whole sort of structures of tokenizing and also like depoliticizing what people have actually come to say, because they're calling out and expressing, you know, very, very, very powerful messages of demand and of enough condemnation also to the lack of accountability that has been going on in terms of when it comes to climate action. And what they received was like, well, that was not your time to speak. We don't want to hear your complaints. Like, unless you're in an event, please leave. And one security guard actually told a friend, like, if you want to express yourself, go outside. So this is the type of, when we talk about communications, it's also how are they lived in participation, right, in these spaces. And okay, I have so many other things, but maybe they might come out in the dialogue. Just to conclude. So I think that we need to move towards, in order to really dignify people's stories and experiences in lives, I think we need to move towards a non-extractive, connective type of communication that is more about facilitation and acknowledging our own positionality and listening than about giving voice or, whatever other saviory language we want to use. And it's also crafting space for other vocabularies and forms of expression, because after all, opening up the range of ways to communicate is really about tapping into what we deem as valuable knowledge. And if we open the space for different ways of communicating, we might open up the space for different proposals, right? So to move away from the sort of imposed, institutionalized, hegemonic, developmental notions of progress or of whatever, justice, and towards all those plural ways of understanding them.
Beautiful.
So yeah, there, I'll end on that.
Yeah, thank you. So many things resonated, Maria, but I actually want to turn, I have a special guest who I was just so happy to see him on the call, and I had invited him, but we lost that track. But Shail Strastra is from Nepal, from Digo Bikas Institute, and talk about new platforms and new solutions. That's all about what Digo Bikas does. And I was really so fortunate to meet with them last year and to sort of hear about some of the dialogues that they've been having with young climate activists to really redefine what is progress for us as Nepalis. And I would love to invite him to just share a little bit about that effort, because that's exactly what we're saying. We cannot use the same assumptions for what is good development, because that's really bankrupting our planet. So Shail, thanks for joining us and welcome.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for inviting me to share my ideas. So yeah, I sorry I'm 10 minutes late for this. So I hope I will still make sense. So in general, so to explain on how we are discussing on redefining development, I think one of the biggest flaws that international agencies does, like when I was in COP in 2015 and COP, I had a feeling like the UN agencies, like I mean, as in Nepal, when I see how UN works in different sectors, the approach that it takes, or the way we see as a community to UN agencies is like they know what they're doing, but then the more in details we go about, we realize that they have no idea what is happening in a way, So I think as a communicator, to be true to the fact that you really don't know what is happening and you are part of that process is something that really helps. Like, even if I say like I know what I'm talking about, then if that is an approach that you're taking, then you're kind of setting the entire process from the other side to come into and to be true that you are still exploring. And it's not about being true to others, but to yourself as well, to know that you actually don't know the right approach, not just contextually, but in that sense, particularly when we're talking about climate change. I think this idea that UN is going to solve it, or we know how to do this kind of an approach is going to disengage people from finding out the right approaches more locally or more contextual things. So I think for me, also to when we talk about rethinking development, I try to make sure that I'm clear that I don't know where I'm heading, but then and I think that is one of the best way to appeal people to engage, to help out, and I think that does help. So we talk, yeah. So basically, I take that I try to be more sincere, more true to myself while communicating, and yeah, I think that helps. I think that in a better way helps to communicate that the world is right now rather more confused about the direction or defining what is right and wrong, because the the need of the time is like systemic transformation, about systems in different structures, like even about dividing issues into different contexts, like our previous speaker was talking about, as a false, is being questioned. Like we divided from the schooling, we divided societies and values into different subjects, and then now we're talking about like multi, I forgot the right term, but multidisciplinary course. So so yeah, again mixing up together and all that. So I think trying to communicate that people who are leading are as confused as you, and that's why the help is really needed from a more grassroots reality. Is I think that really empowers people. I mean, yeah. I think that approach to begin the conversation really helps out.
Awesome. So, Shale, how long have you been doing the rethinking development dialogues locally?
Yeah. So, Digo Vikas itself is like it started in 2015, so it's pretty young. But all the people involved have been involved in this. Like, I'm a media student. I did my bachelor's in media, and that is where like media, culture, and society was part of where I connected myself into like the communication and value systems and how media plays with that and all that. And so it's been 10 years since I started like advocating for like I didn't go directly into rethinking development, but I believe like the present economic systems, present education systems, and present media advocates private cars, and if you go really deep, if you succeed to get away from that communication values and all that, then there's simpler ways of defining cities, or maybe your value systems that provoked me to become a bicycle activist. So I've been communicating about how bicycle is the future and not the past, and so that is how I have my roots into rethinking development. And then I gradually realized like the bicycle in itself is not going to do a lot, because the roots to that problem is broader value systems, and so that is how I am around talking
Came to
about
that.
rethinking development.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. And speaking of value systems, one thing we want to value is questions for these amazing speakers. So I want to pause and offer the last few minutes, knowing we won't get to them all, but also knowing that this is an ongoing conversation. And the first one is from Tosca. How will the goal of communicating with dignity in mind be affected by the new power shifts, by articles, books by Timms and Hymans, which I'm not familiar with. According to New Power Thinking, individual activists want to not just share, but also affiliate, adapt, shape, and influence messaging themselves. Wow, it's a very complicated question, Tosca. Could you narrow it down maybe even? How do we enhance the dignity embedded in communications by organizations? And I think, who is the constituency? All of these things are part of it. And I think, it's a very complicated question because it's, as Maria was saying, there's a lot of contradictions in being an individual activist and trying to really work in a very networked way. Like, there's a real awareness that no individual, no one organization can actually bring about the level of change we're seeking. And so I think it really speaks to, Xiao, you really sort of highlighted how much humility is needed to communicate well. Really just to always be in learning stance can serve you very well, because you continue to add to the things that maybe you didn't realize before. And we go deeper and deeper and deeper. I think when we get away from transactional communications, we're not communicating for the sake of, I'm going to say this so that you do this, right? This whole notion of influence starts to break down, because it's no longer about moving resources and people the way we want them to. We're trying to sort of, what I think is, reimagine what else is possible beyond it. And I think one of the things that's important for us as communicators to think about is, how do we move people basically from also the expectation to be transacted with, and invite them to their own self-reflection about their own role in this bigger thing. And I want to open that back up to you, the speakers, as what are the best ways you've seen where people are being invited to think differently, and still be part of the social good? Maria, you're nodding.
Yeah, no, I think this is the big question, because like you say, communications can become transactional as opposed to reciprocal or participatory or horizontal, right? And it becomes, okay, you give me this interview and I give you exposure, or it becomes this sort of transaction. I've found a lot of inspiration in participatory photography and video. I myself I have experience as a photographer, and knowing how much also visual communication is a useful bridge to sidestep sort of the dangers of detachment from the human story that comes with academic or professional communications, organizational communications. I think like giving people, a tool like a camera or a computer or a video camera in their own hands to do and to do what they want with it, essentially, and to show what they can and want to show is extremely powerful. There's some great organizations doing this. I think Insight Share is one of them. They do participatory video mainly with women and girls. But yeah, I would say participatory methods are something that we need to keep exploring and really taking seriously also.
Go ahead, Grace. Do you have any other questions today? We might finish right at the hour. I know there's always more questions than we actually can articulate. Last time we had more than we had time for. I want to just highlight as we leave some key messages we had from the Shift of Power symposium, and sort of how this all fits together with that bigger change we're seeking. Okay, I don't want to share. I want to present. Sorry, everybody. There were a few things that were really talking about the courage needed to sort of reimagine. And so I think these are things that were sort of shared within the symposium, but I think they really appeal to us as communicators as well. We have to be political. We have to be accountable to our partners, inclusive, experimental, much more brave, and really check our own power, that power of setting, either reinforcing or counteracting the dominant narratives is part of our is indeed part of what's being asked of us. And this matters because there is compassion fatigue. I do think we know that pity and rescue is not a lasting response. And we are all here because we want to contribute to a systemic change, not just one-off. So Nadia has a comment here. There's a great point about participatory arts-based methods, but issues of power dynamics are still at play in those approaches, absolutely. And we have to think about what's culturally appropriate and ways of sharing messages that are coming from elsewhere. Well, thanks for joining us, Nadia. I'm happy that you're writing a PhD exactly about that. We do need more for that. Here we are, we're here to move our audiences from empathy to self-reflection. And how do we do that is what we'll talk about in the next 2 online dialogues. We have one more question here. Any thoughts regarding experiences and communications being an integral part of organizational strategy? Yeah, oftentimes as communications professionals, we're the afterthought. We are under-resourced, overstretched, and that in itself really, whenever we don't have enough time or resources, the status quo wins. Okay, so this is what we were talking about, pace and all these things. Part of our resistance for how we, and knowing that creativity is the thing that's gonna, as Grace said, take us forward in sort of creating new narratives, we have to really guard that space for creativity. And that means sometimes slowing the truck down and allowing for that spaciousness to come back in. I wanted to also give you all our contact details because we're now at time. And I put in the chat Diego Bicas address. We've got everybody on Twitter here. And I'm very glad you all joined us today. And I know we covered a lot, and we always have more questions than time because we also run at a big heart pace. But it's really been a joy to have all these speakers. I want to thank them for their time and insights and for all that they do to shift the power every day. And thank you all, and I hope to see you again soon. Take good care, everybody.